Well, I'm Percy. We've been celebrating my mother's 100th birthday. She comes from a very long-lived family. Mom will be 100 on the 18th of September. And my father got to 91. Her mother got to 96. Her father got to 89. She had two older brothers that have passed away in the last year at 91 and 101 and 103, and until they passed away they were in reasonably good health. They lived on their own ranches in Mexico, so a very long-lived family. Obviously in that period of time, Mom was born in 1918, so obviously a lot of things have happened since then, because they lived in the mountains in Mexico in 1918. You'd have to move that back a few decades as far as standard of living, truly back to pioneer days. And it was that they lived that way until pretty much until we moved to the States as a family. The church has always been important in the life of my dad and my mother. When we lived in Pacheco, Pacheco was kind of the last outpost of civilization. When I lived there, there weren't but a half dozen white families left, and in fact, it dwindled pretty much to nothing by the time I left. When I was about 5, when we moved to Juarez, to describe life down there a little bit, we certainly didn't have a vehicle. The farm work was done with horse-drawn equipment. I remember my dad and my granddad using horse-pulled wagons and plowing behind a horse. They mowed the grass out in the meadow and pulled it into the barn. They didn't bale it. They went out with a pitchfork and threw it on the wagon and hauled it into the barn. There wasn't a sewer system. The sewer system, the bathroom consisted of a little shack out in the back of the lot with a couple of holes in it, and there was no running water. So
ashes.
Pardon me?
It had ashes.
There was no running water, so the water was a well in the out in the yard, and I remember going out to get water. There was a bucket tied on a rope, and you'd let it down into the well and have to switch the rope back and forth to get the bucket to sink, and it would try to float. So you'd have to kind of switch the rope back and forth to get the bucket tipped enough that it would sink. And then sometimes as a yard decoration, you see people with an imitation well in their yard. So after you fill the bucket, you turn the hand crank with a spool to pull the rope back up to the top. There was obviously no electricity, no communication. The mailman did come up to Pacheco, but I think it might have been about once every 30 days. At least it wasn't on a very regular basis. So there was, I guess you could call it 30-day communication. I remember the sacrament meeting was a whole lot different than what we have now. Sacrament meeting was at my dad's parents' home, which was just through the lot from us. On Sundays we would go down to my grandparents' home, and sacrament meeting consisted of my dad's parents, my mother and father, my older sister and myself, and an old bachelor down there. His name was Alma Lunt. Alma Lunt was, I guess today you'd call him illiterate. He didn't read and write, but he memorized one of the sacrament prayers. So he always had the blessing on the water because that's the one that he knew. And then we passed a cup, and everyone took a drink out of the same cup. So sacrament meeting consisted of 7. We didn't have a vehicle of any kind. There were a few old trucks. I think, as far as I recall, they were mostly probably surplus military, World War II military trucks that would haul a little lumber out of the mountains, and once in a while, I guess with either on a truck going to town or a relative or someone going to town. You couldn't get a car up there, no way, not even close. So unless we could snag a ride, we had to go to town by wagon or on horseback. The road by wagon was kind of a long road around, so you couldn't nearly make a round trip in one day by wagon. So it you either spent 2 days on by wagon, and that meant you had to camp somewhere to do that 2-day trip, or else there was a shorter route through the mountains, but it was a trail you couldn't take a wagon on. So it was a day by horseback or 2 days by wagon to get to the nearest store. I was talking yesterday about at the party how there wasn't a doctor up in the mountains, obviously, and so if anyone had medical issues, it was pretty hard to get them to a doctor, since a wagon was a pretty rough ride to get to the doctor. I remember my dad, when my dad held his arms out like this, one of his elbows was the way it should be, the other elbow was up on top, facing the sun. And that was because when he was young, he fell out of a tree, and there wasn't a doctor around to set it, so they just kind of let it grow back on its own. But because it wasn't set, it was turned a quarter turn. That's why his elbow faced up. So he spent the rest of his life with one elbow out to the side and one elbow facing the sky. I also remember my grandfather Johnson. He, in his kind of older age, he was thrown off a horse and broke his leg. And the same situation then. There wasn't a doctor to set his leg, and so I guess they did the best they could and let it grow back. But the bone I assume must have been broken on a slant, because it overlapped when it healed, and one leg was a couple of inches shorter than the other leg because of the way that bone healed, the overlap of the bone. So he walked the rest of his life with a limp, and because of the one leg was short, I remember his shoes being the sole being really thick, because he would put 3 or 4 soles on it to try to equalize the length of his 2 legs. So medical care was pretty much non-existent.
Your grandma was the doctor, the midwife.
Yeah, my dad's mother was kind of the local midwife, and that was one of the problems. I don't know whether she set legs or arms or not. I don't know what all she did, but I know that she was a midwife, and Mexicans would come to the house and want to take them out to some ranchito out somewhere, and so she would be gone sometimes for days at a time out attending to midwife duties or whatever else whatever else she did in the medical field. She never had any medical training, but I guess she was kind of skilled in using herbs and whatever else. So medical care was pretty hard to come by. I don't remember it, but when I was 3, I fell off the porch onto a bucket. The bucket was standing upright, and there's on each side where the handle comes around, there's a hole through a little ear that the handle is hooked to, and I fell on that ear on the bucket, and that's how I got the scar in my chin. And so since I was 3, that was a pretty good wound. I'm now 73, so I've had this for 70 years, and it still looks a little ragged. So it had to be pretty bad looking when I was 3 to still carry the scar that I do. So life was pretty rough up there. Mom never had any kind of conveniences of any kind. she washed every time she wanted to heat anything or cook, she'd build a fire in the wood cook stove, heated water on the stove. When it was every Saturday night, we took a bath. Even when we didn't need it, she still made us take a bath. And so she heated water on the stove and dumped it in a tub, and there we took kind of a tub bath and a spit bath, I guess, and between the two of them we seemed to make out all right. She washed on a washboard and ironed with an iron. We've seen these little antique irons that you heat on the stove. That's what she did. So life was not really good as far as conveniences go, but life was good as far as happiness and kind of a laid back life. My dad and my granddad, they were freighters. They did whatever they had to do to raise a buck. There wasn't much money in circulation, but between bartering and whatever else they could do, they got along okay. Dad and Granddad took a lot of hunters out. That was kind of the last outpost. So they would, if they made it to Pacheco, and it was usually a scheduled hunt, hunters would come down from the States and go to Pacheco, and from there, Dad and Granddad would take them out in the mountains and stay with them for a few days. In some cases, there was a fellow by the name of Leopold Starker that went down and did some early environmental studies in the early 40s. And they would take them out. They would by letter, they would make arrangements when they would come, and they talked about monetary compensation, and they would do their deal making, and told them they'd show up on a certain day or within a couple of days, and they would take them out and leave them all summer, and once a week they would take them some supplies, and so they stayed down there and did their environmental studies. So between that and taking hunting parties out, they were able to raise a little cash. And but when we got in about 1950, when my older sister was old enough to go to school, there wasn't any school in Pacheco, so we moved to Juarez. The reason and Juarez was the closest town. That was the town where we went to the store. By the way, we've seen the documentary. We've all seen the documentary Little House on the Prairie. That's what life was like, and there was a country store where you could buy a few staples, but that was kind of it. And that was a store you went to with a day on horseback or 2 days by wagon. But in about 1950, we moved to Colonia Juarez. That was where there was a ward and quite a few kind of enough people that had come from the States or descendants of those that had come from the States, that the ward was a pretty much ordinary ward, a small ward, but well functioning in Colonia Juarez. Juarez had running water, so that was a big step up. The town had gone together and purchased a generator. I think it was a Caterpillar generator. I suppose it was probably a diesel generator. That would have been probably in the late 40s. And they put a few poles around town and stretched a little wire, so people were able to have electrical power. But they started up the generator at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and shut it off at midnight. So you had to plan your activities. If it involved the need for power, you had to schedule your activities according to when the generator was on. Dad had spent some time because staying in Mexico was kind of a dead end proposition for the kids. For us, Dad had worked out of town for some, and in the late 40s there was an outbreak of hoof and mouth disease, and the U.S. government was hiring veterinarians and inspectors, cattle inspectors, to go out to these ranches down in southern Mexico. So Dad hired out as an inspector for the U.S. government, and they sent him off down to the state of Michoacan. That's over on the west coast and down south below Acapulco. So he went off down there for a couple of years working for the government. He'd come home once a year for a couple of weeks. So he went down there and kind of saved up his money and got ready to move to the States. So in '50 we moved to the States. Dad, when we came to the States, Dad had a job nailed down, but it was a little bit of time before it opened up. But so we moved to Farmington, New Mexico. Let me back up a little bit though. From Colonia Juarez, there weren't any oil roads in Mexico at the time in that area. When we moved out, we went out in the back of a pickup. Mom and Dad, they took everything they had and their kids that had to fit in a pickup, and that in the back of a pickup, and that's when the fenders of a truck were on the inside. Well, that took up quite a bit of space. So all the furniture and suitcases and everything that we owned came out in the back of a pickup. When we got out to the border, it wasn't a problem of citizenship or papers, because our 4 grandparents were all born in the States, and so we could go back and claim American citizenship because they had been all born in the States. But when we got to the border, there had been an outbreak of smallpox in Mexico. So when we got to the border, you had to prove that you were not a risk of bringing smallpox back. When you get a smallpox vaccination, I don't know how you do it now, but we used to get a vaccination, and wherever they gave it to you on your arm, it would create a scab, maybe the size of a dime, maybe the size of a nickel. It would be a heavy, thick, round scab. And
or a quarter.
A quarter. After a period of time, that scab would fall off, but for years and years, it would leave a scar where that scab was. So we got out to the States, and they looked at our arms, and we didn't have any smallpox vaccination scars. So we had to get vaccinated, and they sent us back to Mexico. They vaccinated us like cattle. They sent us back to Mexico to wait till the scab came off and they could see that scar. So we went back and stayed for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we came out again. That time we successfully entered the United States and moved to Farmington, New Mexico. So when we got out there, it was a little while before employment really opened up, and so Dad did whatever he could find. It was kind of rough there for a while, having moved his kids, and everything they could bring out of Mexico had to fit in the back of a truck, and the bed of a truck was about the size of maybe 2 refrigerators. So there wasn't we didn't bring much with us, but we came out and we got started on life in the United States. Dad, he was a roughneck on drilling rigs for a bit, and he dug with pick and shovel, dug trenches for plumbers to put in sewer pipes. So he was literally a ditch digger. So he did whatever he had to do for a bit before he got on with a gas company, a major gas producing company in Farmington, and so things got a lot better then. So that's kind of our early life, as I recall it. Why don't we ask Mom? Mom tells a story of her baptism. Baptism in those days was, well, it wasn't. It was more kind of a you did it whenever it was convenient kind of thing. It didn't happen necessarily on the day or the week or even the month that you turned 8. It was kind of when it was convenient. So Mom, why don't you tell us about when you were baptized?
Well, up in the mountains, it's cold by the time it's my birthday. And I had to go down to the creek to be baptized. The whole family went along and went down to the creek and waded out in that water almost waist deep. It was cold up in the mountain, up down there in September. It was very refreshing.
I think you're forgetting some of the details. You've told me that story quite a few times, and that was that you were baptized in November, by that time it was pretty late in the year, and someone stood up in sacrament meeting and said, so-and-so has a child that he's going to be baptizing today. Anyone else that hasn't been baptized, why don't you come on down? And you hadn't been baptized, so you went down. On the way down to the creek, they saw another brother that was out in the field plowing. They said, brother so-and-so, why don't you come down and be the witness? So he came down to the creek, and you and I think several others were baptized at the same time. And so it was, I guess, kind of a casual thing back in those days.